There comes a point in life when someone who has given their heart endlessly, only to have it crushed by manipulation and betrayal, finally stops asking, "Why me?" and starts asking, "Who am I, really?" For empaths, those sensitive souls who often love deeply and feel the emotions of others as if they were their own, this moment usually comes after enduring the storm of narcissistic abuse. The empath-narcissist relationship is one of the most psychologically explosive dynamics of our time. It begins like a fairy tale, drenched in charm and intensity, only to unravel into gaslighting, control, and soul-crushing devaluation. But what happens after the storm, when the empath finally breaks free? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who gave us concepts like the shadow, the collective unconscious, and individuation, offers a startlingly clear answer. The empath's suffering can become the very fire that forges their ultimate transformation. This is not just a story of pain, it's a story of becoming. Jung saw human life as a journey, not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. And in the wake of narcissistic abuse, the empath stands at the threshold of the deepest psychological work of all, the confrontation with the shadow, the reclaiming of the lost self, and ultimately, the birth of an entirely new identity. What seems like an ending, the destruction of trust, love, and innocence, is actually the beginning of individuation, the final stage of psychological evolution. The purpose of this video is to walk through the journey step by step. We'll explore how the empath and narcissist become locked in their destructive dance, what narcissistic abuse does to the psyche, and how Jung's framework of healing, particularly individuation, shines a light on the path forward. And most importantly, we'll uncover what Jung might call the final stage for the empath, the moment they no longer define themselves through the narcissist, or even through their wounds, but through a profound and integrated sense of self. If you've ever wondered what it means to not just survive narcissistic abuse, but to transform because of it, this is the story Jung helps us tell. 1. The empath-narcissist dynamic. The relationship between an empath and a narcissist is not random. It is a magnetic pull, almost archetypal in nature. The empath, often carrying wounds from early life, feels an unconscious drive to heal others as a way of proving their worth. The narcissist, equally wounded but in the opposite direction, craves validation and adoration to cover their inner emptiness. Together, they form a bond that feels like destiny. One gives endlessly, the other takes without limit. For a time, both believe they found what they were looking for. Carl Jung would have seen this as the unconscious playing itself out through projection. The empath projects onto the narcissist their longing for acceptance, believing that if they can love enough, they will finally be safe. The narcissist projects their disowned vulnerability onto the empath, using control and manipulation to avoid facing their own fragility. Each person becomes a mirror for the other's shadow. It is less a love story and more a collision of archetypes, the wounded healer and the false self. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that it operates beneath conscious awareness. The empath doesn't simply choose the narcissist, they are compelled, as if caught in a spell. And the narcissist, though seemingly confident, is equally trapped, unable to survive without a supply of attention and energy. The relationship is the unconscious seeking resolution, though it usually ends in devastation before transformation becomes possible. 2. narcissistic abuse and its psychological impact. When the relationship shifts from love bombing to devaluation, the empath enters a psychological nightmare. Gaslighting erodes their sense of reality. Words are twisted, truths are denied, and the empath begins to doubt their own mind. Devaluation cuts deeper, convincing the empath that their love is never enough. And then comes discard, the abrupt withdrawal of affection, leaving the empath shattered and questioning their worth. From a Jungian perspective, this process is profoundly destabilizing because it dismantles the ego's fragile structure. The empath, whose identity is often tied to caring for others, finds their selfhood stripped away. Jung wrote extensively about the ego being challenged by forces from the unconscious. Narcissistic abuse functions in a similar way. It shatters illusions and leaves the victim face to face with the void within themselves. The psychological effects are severe. Survivors often experience dissociation, hypervigilance, depression, and an almost physical sense of emptiness. But underneath the devastation lies the possibility of rebirth. The collapse of the ego, painful as it is, creates space for a deeper self to emerge if the empath is willing to confront the shadow and begin the long process of integration. 3. Jung's framework for healing. Carl Jung believed that healing does not come from avoiding pain but from entering it consciously. His psychology is built around the idea that the unconscious must be made conscious. For the empath, this means facing the parts of themselves they have denied, their anger, their need for boundaries, and even their desire for power. The narcissist, in Jung's framework, acts as a mirror of the empath's disowned qualities. Archetypes play a major role in this process. The empath embodies the archetype of the wounded healer, someone who heals others because they themselves have been wounded. The narcissist, in turn, embodies the shadow figure, forcing the empath to confront everything they would rather ignore. Jung would argue that the relationship, though destructive, contains within it the seeds of transformation because it awakens the unconscious content that must be integrated. Dreams, symbols, and synchronicities often become more vivid after leaving a narcissistic relationship. Jung saw this as the psyche's way of guiding the individual toward healing. The empath may dream of battles, floods, or broken mirrors, symbols of the inner war and fragmentation they are experiencing. Paying attention to these messages becomes essential in navigating the path toward individuation. 4. Stages of the empath's recovery after abuse. The journey of healing unfolds in stages, each one demanding patience and courage. The first stage is survival. Here, the empath struggles simply to stabilize. Sleep is restless, trust is shattered, and the nervous system remains in fight-or-flight mode. The priority is not transformation but safety, creating distance from the narcissist, seeking support, and regaining a sense of physical and emotional security. The second stage is awakening. This is when the empath begins to see the relationship for what it truly was, a cycle of abuse, not a love story. Education becomes crucial. Reading about narcissism, trauma, and codependency allows the empath to name what happened. This stage is marked by painful realizations, but also by empowerment, the recognition that the problem was never their lack of love, but the narcissist's inability to receive it. The third stage is shadow work. This is where Jung's psychology comes alive. The empath must face the parts of themselves they repressed in order to keep the relationship alive, their suppressed rage, their deep grief, their need for self-protection. Rather than clinging to the identity of the selfless giver, they begin to embrace their full humanity. Shadow work is not comfortable, but it is essential. It lays the groundwork for the final stage, reclaiming the authentic self. 5. The final stage, individuation and liberation. Individuation, in Jung's terms, is the process of becoming whole. It is the integration of all parts of the psyche, the light and the dark, the conscious and the unconscious. For the empath, individuation is the moment they no longer define themselves in opposition to the narcissist. They are no longer simply not abused or not codependent. They stand as a whole, authentic person, rooted in their own truth. This stage is liberating because it dissolves the old compulsions. The empath no longer feels drawn to fix broken people. They see the patterns clearly and choose differently. They also integrate their own shadow, the anger, assertiveness, and strength they once suppressed become part of their conscious identity. What was once projected onto the narcissist is reclaimed, leading to balance. Jung might describe this as the archetype of the self emerging. The empath discovers an inner center that is larger than the ego, larger than the wounds, and entirely their own. They are no longer fragmented, no longer defined by pain. They become whole, and in that wholeness, they find freedom. 6. Empath's role after individuation. With individuation comes a new sense of purpose. Many empaths, having walked through the fire of narcissistic abuse, feel called to guide others. This does not mean becoming a savior or falling back into codependent roles. Instead, it means embodying wisdom, sharing hard-earned insights, modeling boundaries, and living authentically. Their mere presence becomes healing to others. Boundaries become a natural extension of this stage. The empath no longer feels guilty for saying no. They no longer confuse self-sacrifice with love. They recognize that real compassion must include the self. Jung emphasized the importance of balance, and in this final stage, the empath finally lives in balance between giving and receiving, light and shadow, self and other. The empath's role after individuation is not to wage war against narcissists or to remain stuck in the identity of a victim. It is to live fully, creatively, and consciously. By doing so, they break the cycle not only for themselves but for future generations. 7. Jung's warnings and wisdom. Jung was careful to warn against over-identification with any archetype. For the empath, this means avoiding the trap of clinging to the identity of the wounded one or the healer. Healing is not about building a new mask, it is about shedding masks altogether. The danger lies in turning victimhood into a permanent identity, which keeps the wounds alive instead of integrating them. Another risk is shadow inflation. As the empath integrates their anger and strength, they may swing to the opposite extreme, becoming domineering, cold, or narcissistic themselves. Jung emphasized that the shadow must be integrated, not acted out. Power reclaimed must be balanced with humility. Jung's greatest wisdom for the empath is that wholeness includes everything: the pain, the joy, the mistakes, and the triumphs. Healing is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming real. This reminder keeps the empath grounded as they continue their journey of growth. 8. Modern trauma psychology meets Jung. What makes Jung's framework so remarkable is how well it aligns with modern trauma psychology. Neuroscience shows that trauma fragments the brain's ability to regulate itself, leading to hypervigilance and dissociation. Jung described a similar process in psychological terms: the splitting of the psyche, the loss of contact with the self. Both perspectives agree that healing comes from reintegration. Somatic therapy, for example, emphasizes the importance of reconnecting with the body after trauma. Jung, though not using modern terms, often highlighted the role of embodiment in dreams and symbols. Attachment theory explains why empaths are drawn to narcissists. Unresolved childhood wounds drive them to repeat familiar patterns. Jung's concept of the unconscious compulsion echoes this exactly. By bridging Jung with modern psychology, we see that his insights were not abstract philosophy but practical roadmaps. His framework remains timeless because it speaks to the universal patterns of the human psyche. 9. Critiques and limitations. Of course, Jung's framework is not without limitations. One critique is that Jungian psychology can romanticize suffering, framing it as necessary for growth. While suffering can indeed transform, not all trauma leads to individuation. Some people remain stuck in cycles of pain without support, and no amount of symbolism can replace practical therapy and community care. Another limitation is the empath-narcissist narrative itself. While it captures important dynamics, it can become overly simplistic. Real people exist on spectrums, and labeling one side empath and the other narcissist risks flattening complex human behavior. Jung himself would likely urge caution against rigid categories. Finally, Jung's work, though profound, was rooted in a different era. Integrating his ideas with modern science, diverse cultural perspectives, and trauma-informed practices is essential to make his insights fully applicable today. Conclusion. Carl Jung revealed that the deepest wounds can become the doorway to wholeness. For the empath, narcissistic abuse is a shattering experience that strips away illusions and forces them into the dark night of the soul. But it is precisely in this darkness that individuation becomes possible. By confronting the shadow, reclaiming the self, and integrating the unconscious, the empath moves into their final stage, not defined by pain, but liberated by wholeness. This journey is not easy. It demands courage, patience, and often professional support. But for those who walk it, the reward is immeasurable, a self that is no longer dependent on others for validation, a heart that loves without losing itself, and a life that flows from authenticity. The empath story, seen through Jung's eyes, is not one of permanent victimhood. It is a hero's journey. The narcissist may have been the catalyst, but the final stage belongs to the empath alone. And in that stage, they stand not as broken survivors, but as whole, conscious beings, finally free.